I guess just to get started, it'd be great to hear a bit about your background and your kind of pathway into design and how you got into it.
I think the important part is something you've already mentioned, which is that I'm quite interested in the rules behind things, and that started before I sort of realized I had a career in design. So I've always been interested in the rules behind things that people traditionally believe are not rule-based. That's not just design, it's also things like social interactions. I think a lot of things, including visual design, people learn them without learning the rules. They learn it sort of intuitively, and then they assume that there aren't rules they can learn. I had to, I prefer to approach it in a rule-based way. I think that's the way my brain works. So I assumed that everything in visual design and interaction design could be explained with rules. And with that starting point, I just started learning and trying to unpack it all. And so far, I haven't found anything that isn't based on a rule. And I think I've generally explored most things about interface design, especially at this point. So my theory still holds. Having said that, I think it's perfectly valid and possible to learn to be a good visual and interaction designer without knowing the rules, essentially. You can do it through your intuition, through having it as sort of muscle memory, or what's that phrase where you drive a car without thinking? It's got second in the name. My mind's gone blank. Maybe it'll come back to me. But basically, yes, without learning the rules, I think you can still be a very good designer. So I'm not trying to suggest that everyone should know the rules. Yeah, apart from that, career-wise, I've always worked for relatively unknown companies. So there's probably not much interesting to talk about there, but I've always worked on SaaS products. Yeah, I don't know what else to talk about really about myself. It's probably the important stuff.
There's a couple of suggestions in the chat there that autopilot.
Second nature.
Second nature, is that the?
Yeah, second nature. That's the one. Thank you.
And was there? Do you think that was it anything that you? Was there any other things? Do you think that may make you think like that in terms of rules, or do you think it's just something inherent in the way you approach things? Like, I don't know if there was any other things that had rules that kind of got you to think like that. Do you think as a growing up, or I don't know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I assume it's something sort of natural about me, because I know that people are approach life in different ways, and some people need to learn those rules more and make sure they don't insult people, for example, when they say certain things. They're sort of consciously aware of the things they shouldn't say, and some people are unconsciously aware of the things they shouldn't say. I think the more conscious you are, maybe the more you prefer to see life as a bundle of rules. In design specifically, I think this was triggered because I was learning a lot about interaction design, especially from books, UX design in general. And then I thought, okay, I want to improve my visual design skills. So I started looking for books about visual design and found that there aren't that many. Especially when you initially look, there are very few. I've looked much harder since, and I think I've got all of them in a list somewhere. But yeah, because there wasn't much written down about visual design, that made me sort of frustrated. And that frustration drove my desire to learn all of the underlying rules so that, it could be written down and it wouldn't just remain this intuitive second nature type of skill.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because as a designer, you often get thrown into the practice of design, whether it be graphic design, even like in college or things like that. You might learn typography or the different elements, and you might learn the history, but interaction design as a craft, there's no real manuals, I don't think, or there's not many that I would have come across either. So it's interesting, and I think that's why I liked your work when you see it, because you're kind of getting into that space where there isn't much material. So like getting into the finer details of like things like spacing and buttons and backgrounds and things like that.
Yeah, it's I think because I need to work that way, it frustrated me that no one else was working that way, and so I guess I'm trying to learn all this stuff, but also because it's helped me a lot just to learn it from that way, but also to record it all so that other people can, if they think in the same way, learn that way. I think it's especially important if like me, you don't work under other designers. I've never actually worked under a more senior designer. And at this point, I'm about 8.5 years into my career. So I've never had a mentor that I worked for or someone I could look over the shoulder of when they were designing. And so I had to learn all of this stuff myself. And I think especially if you don't have that sort of mentor relationship, you can't pick up some of those more intuitive things unless you can find other senior designers in the community to watch as they work, which is a bit of a strange arrangement. I doubt that's easy to come by, which is a shame. It would be nicer if we could all sort of watch people design more often, because I think we'd learn some things more intuitively.
Yeah, I think that was actually one of my questions. I think I was wondering about that, and especially running a group like this as well, if there's ways that you could get that. Like I would have gone a long time being self-taught as a designer with freelance, and then moving into SaaS companies, learned a hell of a lot from more senior designers. So I think it really is valuable. But I don't know how you facilitate that, where you can see what people are doing and they explain their thought process. And I think it's something like you see there are YouTube tutorials and things like that, but they tend to be, they're not necessarily people who are working in the profession. I think like they're kind of designed, I think, more to, I don't know, maybe beginners, or maybe to people just get like, perhaps more people just getting into it. I don't know, but that's maybe.
The few approaches I've seen that I think are practically useful are, one is recreating someone else's work, which is the most accessible. And that means that you can essentially go through the same steps they went through, but you're not necessarily experiencing all of the things they didn't, or they tried and that didn't work. And so you're not experiencing that sort of decision tree they went through. Another approach I've seen is that sometimes people will stream an entire design process on Twitch, or they'll release a YouTube series where they basically design an entire website and then, for example, code it. I've generally found that when people do that, they've already made some decisions that are actually quite crucial to the design process. And so they're helping you join them, or they're letting you join them at the point where they've basically planned out the layout, for example. Mm-hmm. And so that they're basically just drawing boxes in places that they've predetermined. Also, especially, those are quite long processes. And so sometimes they're in time lapse. And so you're not hearing someone talk through or reason about why they're making changes. Even if you do see them make changes during that process, you'll see them made quickly because it's a time lapse or whatever. And also, if you're watching, let's say, a Twitch stream of someone designing a website, it might be an 8-hour-long Twitch stream or something. That's few people actually have that time to sit down and watch 8 hours of design. So it's hard to sort of get the part that you're really interested in and miss the rest. So I found those methods interesting or practical, but they've all got problems, whereas if you're seeing someone design something and you work with that person and they're working on a problem that you might work on one day, that's a lot more relevant. I think it's easier to feel engaged with that sort of process.
Yeah, I think as well, I guess maybe you're missing the interactive element. If you're just watching a tutorial or a stream, well, maybe a stream, you can add messages maybe, or ask questions, but it could be, depending on how popular it is, it could be difficult. So I think if you're working with someone, you could go to them, you work together, you could go to them with a specific problem you were having, like, why isn't this design working, or how should I approach this problem? Maybe that's, but yeah, I don't, if anyone thinks of a way to facilitate that kind of experience, I think it would be great.
At one point, I trawled through YouTube and basically looked for videos where people were sharing their design process in that way, in a detailed way that people could learn from, because I was interested for the same reason that it's come up now. And I added them to a playlist, and I think there's about 10 sort of instances of that I could find. And there's probably more since, but not just time lapses, but people actually talking through the design process and how they make decisions. I couldn't find many. So there's definitely a gap in the market if people want to start making videos.
Yeah. I just jumped to, Michelle had a question there around rules. So it's a good question. How do you learn when to break the rules?
Yeah, this is potentially controversial, but because of my sort of out there belief that everything is rule-based, I believe that when you're breaking rules, you're actually following other rules. And so I think when you break the rules, you make bad design. And I think what people think of as breaking the rules, I think it's valid to think of it that way. So I'm not criticizing the question. But I think essentially you're saying, I don't want to follow rule X, I'm going to follow rule Y instead. And it might be that a designer who decides not to follow rule X is not aware that rule Y exists. But I think for things to look good or to work well, they need to follow a rule of some kind, because I also believe rules are how we sort of understand the world. And so it is fitting into a structure of some kind, essentially. I don't know if that makes perfect sense, Michelle, but essentially I believe that you're breaking one rule and then following a potentially secret other rule, also potentially without realizing it.
And presumably then the other rule is allowing you to break the first rule.
Yeah, because sometimes the rules conflict. If you you could say that a pretty decent rule is for your layout of a website to be quite orderly, so that people can scan through it and understand it well. But then you might also ignore that and follow a different rule, which says that if your layout is quite chaotic, then it can be visually interesting and it gives person a sort of a playground for their eyes. And so there's sort of two approaches you can take there, and both is following a rule of some kind. One is potentially the more sort of accepted rule or traditional rule. So I think those are the ones we think of as rules. And the other ones are sort of not quite hacks, but they're almost alternatives that people don't consider often. And so they feel like, oh, I'm doing something different here, which is quite powerful.
Cool, thank you for that. So I think I'd like to ask a couple of questions about, I might come back to that actually, because I think there's an interesting area around rules and creativity. I think we probably could talk about. I would quite like to ask around.
Michelle asked a follow-up question that I think would be interesting later on to get into.
Yeah, I'd quite like to ask or to get your thoughts on design roles, though. I think it's something I found quite. But there's just so many of them, and they change quite a lot. And do you think, like, I think visual design and UI design has gone through a bit of a shift in the way it's perceived. I personally feel that. I was wondering if you think it's changed. Do you think you see endless reposts of the UX versus UI nonsense that you can't really get away from? But like, how do you think the role should be defined? Would be one question, I suppose.
Yeah, I have seen all the UX versus UI things. I never get involved in those conversations. I'm not saying I won't answer your question, but in public, I never get involved in those conversations. And that's because I don't find the definitions useful. And that's mainly because a lot of the definitions that are commonly used are ambiguous. And so you see it with everything that has a name and that people argue about the name. That's a clear sign to me that those names are not quite right. And I think part of the reason they stick around is because it's hard to shift everyone over to saying something different. But I think if you ask 5 people what UX and UI mean, you probably get 5 different answers, which is where the arguments come from. So I think role definitions are a bit tricky because it's important in some situations to have a well-defined role. But in another sense, I think it's not important, in the sense that it probably depends entirely on the company you're working for and how they view it, which comes back to something I got from Don Norman, actually, in one of his talks or books, where he talks about salt and pepper shakers. And you have the 1 hole in one of the shakers and the 3 holes, or however many 4 holes in another shaker. And people have a sort of intuitive understanding for them of which has salt and which has pepper. But actually, what's important is the belief of the person who refilled the shakers last. And so if the person who refilled the shakers believes that salt goes into the one with 3 holes, it doesn't matter if you believe that salt is in the one with 1 hole, because you're going to get pepper when you try and pour salt out of it. So I guess it's a long way of saying that I tend to avoid those sorts of terms and definitions because they're not particularly helpful to someone who tries to think in a very orderly way like I do. And so I basically came up with my own definitions to describe what I do. And so I talk about designing software interfaces because that, to me, directly describes what I do with my career. I talk about interface design as being split into visual and interaction design. And some of those already have sort of baggage, like interaction designer was an old name for UX designer or product designer. And so that shifted over time. And so I also have specific definitions for what I mean by visual design, interaction design. And those are sort of hierarchical and they feel quite clean in my head. And so I stick with those whenever I talk about it and don't get involved in people talking about UX design or UI design, because there's just too much uncertainty there. And you're having a different conversation with everyone you speak to about those terms.
And then would you classify yourself as being more on the interaction design side of things? And I guess there's also the B designers who are more involved in UX research and those kind of discovery stages as well.
Yeah, in my career, I focus on interface design, and in my head, that's essentially distinct from a researcher. I think UX interface design should always be informed by research, and so I think that's an important part of it. But I don't consider it part of interface design. I consider it as sort of a prerequisite. But I would prefer, ideally, if someone else did the bulk of the research work and I could do the bulk of the interface work, and we collaborate strongly with each other. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy with the sort of research role title, because I think that describes quite well what someone who's focused on that is doing. But the sort of other side of it, the person who's actually designing the interface, I would call an interface designer, unless I'm applying to a job, in which case I use whatever language the company I'm applying to uses, because they're the ones filling up the salt shaker.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me more to another question, I suppose, around that. Like, how involved do you, that I find myself increasingly involved with the business side of things, like why I'm designing things, what the problem is, how the solution is going to help the business, what metrics is going to affect, all this kind of outcome-orientated design. How involved do you feel like the designer should be in the problem space? Do you think that should be left and we should concentrate on the design, or do you think we have to be involved in that, or do you have a different opinion? Maybe, I don't know.
I said earlier that I prefer to focus on interface design, but over the years I had read books about and learned and done research work, like discovery work, and also some more product managery type work. And so I think it's important for someone to be able to speak that language and know what goes on in those processes. Just like people talk about people say should designers code. I believe it should be should designers understand development, because that's slightly different. And so I believe that, yes, a designer should know about all of those things, and ideally have read books about them and have practiced them sometimes. I think, for example, if the researcher was off sick for a week, I'd be completely comfortable jumping in and doing the research work, as long as I wasn't picking up something that they had started and I didn't know what it was. If I was starting something from scratch, I'm perfectly comfortable doing discovery calls, for example. And so I think it's important for a designer to know about those things and be able to at least have the conversations with those people doing those things. If not, do them themselves. If they're working for a small startup, and they're the only product-related person in the entire organization, then someone has to do that discovery work. And I guess that would fall to the designer. So I think people should be comfortable with all of those topics, even if they want to focus on just one of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, like you say, it probably depends a bit on the scale of the company as well, to some degree, and what the expectations are. So I've got a very big general question here, but I think I'd be interested in what you think makes well-designed software. And I think the follow-up question is probably more interesting, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, well-designed software. I have actually got a list somewhere where I've tried to define this. I basically, the way I write these lists is I wait until I come across something that seems like a factor in well-designed software, and then I add it to the list. And eventually you've got, eventually you run out of things to add, or you can't discover anything new, and I assume it's then complete. But I say all that because I have thought about this a lot, and I think there's 20 plus items on the list. So I can't really tell you all of them, but I've also defined I think I called them like this 4 signals of quality or 6 signals of quality. So generally I think about it in much broader sense as the performance. I'm remembering off the top of my head here. Performance is one of them. So how well does the software perform? And that includes things like usability, like how well does it do the thing it's supposed to do, which requires an understanding of what the software is supposed to do if you're designing it. So that's where that research prerequisite comes in. Another one is beauty. I think that's sort of distinct in terms of quality. Like, does something look good? Especially because beauty has these practical benefits, like it attracts people to use your product. It helps them, a lot of the things we think make something beautiful are actually also usability issues. So something beautiful is often easier to understand just because you can look at it more easily. It's more orderly, it uses color well, that sort of thing. Those are all interaction design concerns as well. Performance, beauty, and on the spot, I forget the rest. I'll probably have to go and look at my list if you want me to.
Yeah, no, I just posted. I forgot to post a link to your website actually, and your Twitter, and I just as well the newsletter where I came across you originally, and I think I'll find that link and put it up as well later on. But I think that the follow-up question I actually had probably relates to that, because I was thinking like, what are the differences between great usability and great design, and can something be like, can something be very usable and ugly, and is that great design, or does it have to be both? I suppose is kind of the thinking. I was kind of thinking around that area.
Yes, so I think that usability. I generally think the usability is the more important of the two. If something's usable and beautiful, that's great. If you can't have both, then probably you should focus on usable. I think that requiring usability brings along a lot of the things that make something beautiful in the first place. And so if it's truly usable, I think it will generally be more beautiful than something that is less usable. And that's because I think there's a big overlap between interaction design and visual design. There are very few things that are purely visual design or purely interaction design, because especially because in a lot of our software interfaces, we rely on sight. I know that not all software does rely on sight, and that not all people have use of their sight. But if you take the bulk of software, it's generally using a visual user interface. And so if you focus on that type of interface, then I think the massive overlap between interaction design and visual design means that you're going to get some beauty for free, essentially, if you make something as usable as possible. I think that comes from things like visual hierarchy, good use of color contrast, images that help you understand what you're looking at. A lot of the things that we consider making something beautiful are actually also helping the usability. So it's hard to separate them, but I think if you've got a choice, then you should focus on usability. And a good example, a classic example that probably everyone knows is Craigslist, which uses what you could consider the sort of default style of the web, but has been successful for decades at this point, and they show no signs of needing to change. So it may not be considered beautiful by most, but it certainly seems to be usable.
Yeah, maybe well, I'm sure there's other factors as well, but I guess valuable as well would be a big one to incorporate. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how designers communicate their design work, and I did it in the form of a hypothetical question. And after this, I might just leave a little break as well if anyone else wants to ask a question. So if you want to think of any in the meantime. So if you were interviewing someone for a design role, would you prefer someone who could communicate the value of their design well, but had a poor design, or someone who had a great design but was unable to explain it?
That's an interesting question, because I have strong opinions about design interviews from my own experiences. I guess I'd ask you to clarify, do you mean that they can't explain it in the interview, or they can't explain it ever? Because I especially suffer from like pressure-based recall and everything. Sort of my mind locks up, even though I feel quite confident. My mind locks up and it won't give me anything just because I'm in this high pressure interview situation. So I'm guessing you're talking about general skills rather than just interview pressure situations.
Yeah, I think I said interview, but I guess it could have been in any scenario, but it probably is going to be a pressure scenario. Like either it would be like maybe within a critique, perhaps maybe within the critique with designers, which might not be as stressful. But I suppose generally their ability to communicate face to face, perhaps, or like to a group of people. I was kind of thinking along those lines, I guess, with the interview framing of it.
Yeah, so as long as they have relatively kind companions in that situation, I think those people can help to unpack what's good about the design, and I probably prefer a good design from someone who can't communicate it. But I'm sure, as most of us have experienced, it's not always easy to find people who will treat you with that kind of respect's not quite the right word, but be that patient with you. And being able to communicate your design decisions is extremely important, especially as you're working in a slightly more a situation where you have to prove yourself slightly more. And so it's hard to answer the question, because a design that isn't good, like no one wants that to get out into the world. And so someone who can convince others more easily of putting that out into the world is probably not a good thing on balance.
Yeah.
But I probably prefer to hire someone who could produce good designs and can't explain them personally, because I'd be a bit more sort of forgiving in terms of helping them to understand why it's a good design. Whereas if they're working for like a CEO who's really passionate and doesn't know much about design, maybe they need the explanation skills.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, and probably not exactly an easy question, I don't think, but so I'll leave a bit of space there. If anybody has a question, I might just go back to your question there, Michelle. So something I was thinking about, I think you put there, how does breaking the rules apply to creating something new? Or perhaps I was thinking along the terms of, how does using rules apply to creating something new, that creative spark? How can you make that like, what's the rule for the kind of idea? Because that seems like something that would be hard to create a rule for. I don't know if that's what you're thinking, Michelle, but that's kind of, I was thinking a bit along those lines myself.
Yeah, I think I understand the question, so I'm happy to answer it unless Michelle wants to clarify. Oh, yeah, actually, pretty much yes. Okay, so generally, I think that creativity is the output where lots of design is the input. So I think creativity comes from having a lot of sort of raw material to draw on. And so for creating something new, I would say that the rule is essentially that you need to look at a lot of design, ideally good design, but maybe look at bad design as well, so that you know what to avoid, as long as you know it's bad design. I should add that caveat. And if you watch, you might have seen Kirby Ferguson's Everything is a Remix. It's a great series basically talking about how there's nothing new under the sun and everything is remixed from something else. And so I think you should look at good design. I think you should look outside the field of design. One of the obvious ones is graphic design, because it's sort of adjacent to interface design, but it's not the same. And so there's lots of interesting visual exploration been done over the years, especially if you look back in time. A lot of the most impactful or novel interface or website design I see has actually been inspired by graphic design from the 50s, for example. And so it's clear that you can go back and essentially recycle some of the ideas that people came up with decades ago, and it looks new just because it's unfamiliar to the sort of context you're working in this case, interfaces or websites. So I'd say if you look at a lot of stuff, and if you look at a broad range of stuff from different fields, then you're more likely to come up with sort of much more creative ideas and be less sort of constrained by the sorts of things you're working on every day. Whereas if you only look at the sorts of things you're working on every day, you're probably producing things that seem unoriginal, essentially. There are some other methods you can use. I read a great book by a graphic designer where they essentially listed all the techniques you can use to come up with interesting graphic design ideas. I think a lot of those would work for the more expressive side of interface design, like websites. One example they give is that if you take a list of verbs, for example, like crush and stretch, and these sorts are quite dramatic verbs. And then you take your concept like wealth. You basically apply each of those verbs to the concept, and you see what kind of visual ideas that calls up. And so there are also these sort of structured approaches you can take to brainstorm what feel like sort of novel visual ideas. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So you kind of do have rules for inspiration, or at least kind of techniques for drawing it, or like asking questions that can create inspiration. I'll just go back to Julian's question. I don't know if you want to unmic and ask it yourself, Julian, or I can read it for you. Okay, I'll just read that. So, could you share some thoughts on design interviews? I've been having strange experiences with design interviews lately. You might have to elaborate on the strange experiences.
I've got general thoughts about design interviews, which I can talk about until Julian elaborates. But the first thing that always sort of bothers me is that every company has different requirements, and generally, Julian, I can see you're on video, so you can elaborate if you like now.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like a broad question, but yeah, I mean, it's just like kind of like as you said, that design means something different for like every company. So that I've taken that as like an axiom, let's say. And it's just yeah, I mean, I asked that because you said earlier that you had some thoughts about this. So I just I follow you on Twitter, so I maybe thought you would have some sort of observations. But maybe more specifically, I can say that yeah, I guess I've been struggling with this idea that like in a general sense, I've found that some companies like don't understand that, or like maybe don't see design as a transferable skill. And maybe that's a more specific question. Like, do you think design is transferable skill? Like when you get denied a job because like you don't have enough experience in X field, like I'm like kind of like speechless because I've been dealing with a lot of like different interviews right now. But so maybe to keep it more specifically, what do you think of that? Like, is design like a transferable skill? Just some thought.
I've struggled with this myself all of my career, so I don't necessarily have any answers, or maybe one, but I definitely appreciate the problem, because at various points in my career I've wanted to break out of sort of designing B2B SaaS products and focus on, let's say, a consumer mobile app, especially because if you're focused on quality and design, usually the companies that can prioritize quality are the ones that need to rely on small payments very often, because without that quality, people churn too quickly. Whereas I've worked on software where basically the audience is a captive audience. They can't stop using it even if they want to, because they'll get fired or whatever. And so that's not a recipe for quality. So yeah, I've wanted to move into different areas, focus on different things. I believe that all of those skills are transferable. I believe that any designer who's curious enough and cares enough about design could pick up, learn, and quickly get sort of comfortable with any design challenge, partly because that's what design as a skill is there for. It's a quite general purpose skill where you're learning about a problem and then thinking up a solution. I think the skill set we have is sort of quite well suited to that being any problem. I'm not saying like design a hammer will be easy compared to design an app, but I think app versus website versus SaaS application, there's not much difference that you can't pick up in at least a few weeks of solid reading. So I've struggled with that as well. I think I've come to the conclusion that the main problem that people like you and I face is that the companies that are hiring have a lot of work to do to get that hiring done. And so they're extremely grateful for anything that saves them, even the smallest amount of time. And anyone who comes along and says, oh, you're working on a payments app for mobile, I've also worked on a payments app for mobile, that's an immediate yes in terms of, okay, I know this person can do the job. Whereas the burden of proof is on someone to prove that someone who's working on a B2B SaaS application can also design a payments mobile app, and the hiring manager is not going to do the work. So the burden of proof is actually on the candidate. And so how can you prove to a hiring manager in their 10-second snap decision when they look through your CV that yes, this person is capable. Unfortunately, I think the most practical approach is to become famous, because if you're like famous and everyone knows you as a good designer, then companies will want you even if you don't have immediately obvious experience. I think that's how a lot of designers that people know on Twitter sort of get some of those jobs. So I think so I guess the one answer I was talking about is if you can think of a way to make both your CV or resume and your portfolio make it seem obvious that you're capable, whether that's like side projects or a really good critique of an app in that space, where it's very quick for anyone who's paying attention that you do feel comfortable in that area, then you could try that. But you're always up against people who might have had direct experience, and that's always a hard one to beat. So it might have to be sort of very small steps towards your goal rather than a big leap, which is sort of what I've done in my career. I've now moved to a more sort of consumer-focused space, but it's still a B2B SaaS app.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think those are some good thoughts. One thing that I've just to add that I think of I'm gonna start doing is just to add like a blog section to my portfolio, right? So there's articles that I find interesting about design, some like interesting design critiques, so like maybe that's a way to say, hey, it's not only that I'm obviously solving the specific problems, but also I care about the field in general. So
yeah. And also, this sounds silly, but if you apply to the right companies, then they will take the time to actually, first of all, they'll care about different things in that initial screen where they pick people to shortlist. And second of all, they'll ask better questions. This is a bit silly, but when I was applying for jobs before I got my current job, actually, the one thing I kept failing on in interviews was people couldn't see enough proof of my visual design skill. Which for me is absolutely mad because I've spent 5+ years at this point focused purely on visual design and how I can learn to be better at it. And so I just wasn't giving enough proof in the work I was presenting that I had good visual design skills. And that was because I didn't have any projects that I'd done professionally that required those skills. I'd always been working on these B2B SaaS apps. Visual design was not a priority. And so it wasn't obvious to people I was applying to that I could do that, even though hopefully now it's clear that I can. The reason I got my current job is because the interviewer actually said to me, oh, we've noticed there's not much proof of your visual design skills. Can you talk about that? No other interviewer I've ever spoken to who's rejected me on that basis has ever asked me to talk more about why I'm lacking visual design proof. And as soon as they asked me that, I answered the question, and that was like the final thing that was holding them back, and then they gave me the job. So if you find the right interviewer, they'll actually dig into the things that concerning them rather than just reject you outright. So it could be that there are other things that make you an attractive candidate, and they will actually work through the things that aren't as obvious or that they are worried about. But I found that's extremely rare, which is a shame because it's a better way to interview from the candidate's experience.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm going to stop ranting about career stuff now because it's I could talk about it for a long time.
I think it's an interesting area, and I was actually just curious, Julian, if it was kind of the industry that was different. I know because I was thinking like this growth design and maybe like fintech, and I had I was thinking like dev tools. Those kind of areas were quite specific skill sets, or was it more that it's like I'm going from pharmaceutical to something else? Was there any industry I could think of?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was for like it was a company that has to do with like media, like handling videos upload from users. Frankly, the way I see it, it's kind of just like a dashboard, with like clear user flows that people are able to like do their tasks. But for them, it was like significant that I hadn't worked in that space when I've worked also in B2C, B2B, and so and it's just like I'm constantly like I make it to second, third round, but it's just I also know that the market is cluttered a little bit. I'm also North America, but it's just these things, and sort of like it's when you look for a job again, it's kind of like you're just reminded of like how people see the field from other perspectives, so you have to I'm adjusting it. That's just how it is, but it was mostly the industry thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would be in probably one question for Anthony on that topic as well. I would be interested to know how you feel about whether you would prefer a whiteboard challenge or a take-home project. I've done whiteboard challenges and I find them terrifying. I really do. Even though I know how to do the work, it's like condensing your whole design process into a short period of time. But I'd be interested at how you feel about those techniques.
Yeah, I have failed every take-home challenge I've ever been given. And I found it's a similar problem. It's always, as far as I can tell, I failed them because the expectations of the people setting the challenge or the task are different from my expectations, and they haven't done anything to make those expectations clear. Even if they've written, here's what we'll be judging you on, more or less, in like the document they send over, they end up judging me on something else, which I think is a problem with applying to design jobs broadly. The company will say in their job description, this is what we think is important. And you could speak directly to those points and then find that actually what they rejected you for was something else. And so I hate take-home tasks. I'm sure some people thrive at them, but I have, as far as I know, done well at every whiteboard challenge I've done, and I really enjoy a whiteboard challenge. I know that some people do find them terrifying because they're on the spot. I really enjoy, as long as I'm talking to someone through the process, standing in front of a whiteboard and coming up with things off the top of my head. For whatever reason, I find that easy. And I haven't done many, so it could be that I'd fail more if I tried them. But I think generally interview tasks are a bad idea. And so just because they tend not to really measure anything useful about candidates, I would avoid all of them, and have done if I'm in the interviewing position myself.
Yeah, I suppose that I don't know. I find them very difficult. I think it's I don't know. I'm not sure really how much, but it's kind of they're going into your design process, and then you're working with their team as well. So you have to. They're kind of judging how you collaborate as well at the same time, and then you have to explain your ideas and do your ideas at the same time and be aware that you're being interviewed. I just find it quite stressful, but that's just me. I guess it kind of leads me to a question around your processes. That I would be interested to know what your design process is. Do you have a kind of framework? Now, you may have written this up. Like, do you have, when you get a new project, do you say, all right, this is stage 1, stage 2, or is it more or less structured?
Yeah, when I started out in my career, I had read all the books, and the books generally talk about, the UX design books this is, the books generally talk about a process you should follow. You'll find plenty of books that talk through a specific process. And that led to some problems for me, because I would think that was the correct process, or some sort of combination of the things I'd read about was the correct process. And then I'd get really frustrated when the company I was working for didn't follow that process or didn't want to. I was sort of banging my head against a brick wall. So then I had this big mental shift where now I consider it a bag of tools, basically. It's like a toolkit. And so depending on the situation, I pull out various tools. And so there are projects I've done where there's no research at all. Not because we didn't have time, or because research, or because I'm lazy or something, and that has happened as well. But because in some projects you sort of already understand the problem quite well, and so you don't really need research. It's a very quick change you're making. There are other projects where I go for the full process of, do some research, then do some insights, sort of affinity mapping for insights, talk through that with other people who are working on the project. Then you sort of decide on a direction, or you compare opportunities you might address. So I've used those sorts of processes that are much more structured. But generally, I think a designer should be aware of them all and know when those things should be used, and then use them when appropriate. And so I don't really have a process, except when people ask me, I do talk about how the general process is understanding, and then ideation, and then execution. So I generally stick to those three broad areas, but they're quite loose. So my understanding might already exist if it's quite a simple problem. And the ideation might be sort of quickly sketching some things out on a piece of paper, or jumping straight into Figma and doing mock-ups immediately because we've got a design system, or I already know how it should look and I want to make sure that works. And then execution is usually about working with others. So talking to the developers, making sure that things that crazy ideas I'll come up with are possible technically, because that can always trip you up. I think maybe the thing I would never want to sort of skip out on is shared understanding. And so that could be that you're going and finding things out from other people, like proper research. But as long as everyone who's working on something understands the same thing as each other, same things, then I think the design process can work no matter what it is. Especially if you're sort of more experienced people, you sort of muddle through and get things right. But I would also say that the bigger the company, I think the more process is needed. Hopefully as little process as possible, but with all those people working together, the potential for miscommunication is massive. And so you generally need more process just to make sure that that shared understanding is actually shared, rather than just being limited to the design team and then the developers don't know what's going on, or the product managers decide everything and the developers and designers weren't involved in the discussions and so on. So I think the more process, the bigger the company. But I like to keep it quite loose in terms of specifics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about shared understanding. I probably would have gone through a similar journey with processes and being quite dogmatic about them when I first learned them. Like everything has to be the double diamond or something like this, and then gradually getting to the point where it's like, yeah, I think taking the pieces you need from them when you need them is great advice. And how do you have ways to try and build that shared understanding? Have you ever gone down a path on your own and then realize, oh, no one else is really invested in this, that kind of thing? Or is it more sharing your work early and making sure people have visibility of what you're doing? Or maybe I'm just kind of like to.
I do like to, at least at the start of the project, have a conversation with everyone, maybe separate conversations if it's a hot topic, but conversations with people who can derail the project essentially, because I want to understand their thought process. You might quickly realize that actually the CEO who has final say doesn't care that much about it. And so you won't get much input from them, but they could at the last moment suddenly come in and be like, I don't like how this looks. And so that derails everything. And so I think it's important to find out whether everyone's on board with it in that sense. And that on board with it doesn't necessarily mean that they're happy for you to go ahead, because like I say, someone could be happy for you to go ahead and then you take it in a certain direction and they don't like it and they sort of cause problems later on. So there's maybe some sort of politics involved there where you have to, or some like, not underhanded, but there's some slightly more sort of conflict going on there if you're trying to figure out whether someone's going to cause problems later. Especially if they don't think they care, then it turns out they do. But that's getting a bit too deep into that topic. I've done things in the past, shared understanding, where basically we'll take some research insights and I'll sit down with the other person who's most involved in that project and we'll say, okay, let's take these one at a time and see if we agree on what they mean. And we've quickly realized that this thing that this customer said, we both have a completely different understanding of it. And so getting that sort of thing straight from the start is important. Otherwise, I found that you start having disagreements far too late in the process. Like ideally, everyone agrees on what to do, what the problem is at the start. And then all the disagreements are about very specific details, like should this button be on the left or the right? And what should the label be? Which are the sort of disagreements that are much easier to settle in that sort of let's design this thing phase. But if you're designing something and someone comes up and says, oh, I'm not sure the feature should work this way, that's like too late in the process. Everyone gets annoyed. You have to go back. It takes twice as long. So I think generally the only method I've used is sitting down and discussing it with people, except that I will say I like to record things in a lot of detail for my own purposes, in like documentation, for example, specifications, that sort of thing. And they don't have to be a very specific format. But as long as you're laying out sort of all of your assumptions, the questions you've thought of and how to answer them, that can help other people jump in and say like, oh, I would have had different answer to this question. Like, what should happen if someone clicks this button? Like, how should it behave? Although maybe that's a bit later on in the process. I'm trying to think of a research type. Oh, so if you have a question about like, who is this actually affecting? Like what percentage of people? If you go and answer that question, like, oh, we found out it affects 5% of people, it could be that everyone else assumed it affects 60% of people. And that's a big difference in how important that feature is. And so getting that out of the way first, making sure everyone's aware of how important it is or how many people it affects, can avoid some of those annoying conversations later.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I've definitely had that experience as well, where I've agreed with people, but we were agreeing on different things. We each had a different picture in our head of what we were agreeing on, and then you don't realize until later on at which point you've gone down a certain path. Cool. I think I might. I don't know. I'm coming up to time now, so I don't know, I'll try and squeeze in one more question. I tell you what, I might just leave a pause there if anyone wants to fire a last question to Anthony before we wrap up.
Yeah, I could talk for 6 hours about this, so probably best to cut me off at some point.
I suppose I might just ask one final question myself. Oh no, there's one question. Okay. Any thoughts about product managers versus product designers in terms of responsibility? I like that question too.
I might disappoint you because I think, again, this comes down to the company that those people are working for. I've seen different situations where, for example, a product manager expects to do all the research versus a designer expects to do all the research. Because I like to focus on interface design, I'm happy for the product manager to do a lot of the discovery work. And then maybe if I'm doing sort of testing of something I've actually designed, then I jump on a call with someone or talk to them about a specific way they use something. But like, what problem should we go and solve? I would prefer that be done by a product manager, but that's very specific to me. And it could be that the company I work for prefers designers to focus on that. Or the product managers even prefer designers to focus on that. So I think as long as those responsibilities are laid out sort of by the team and everyone understands them, and again, as long as that's sort of laid out and clear when you're applying for the job and potentially joining the company, that's what's important. And so for me personally, I think the product manager should focus on discovery, any sort of political work that needs to be done in terms of air cover from people who could meddle. And so I don't think the designer should be talking to the CEO necessarily if there's product people involved, especially if there's like a head of product. If the CEO is jumping into like critique sessions for specific screens, I think there's probably a problem there in terms of the organizational hierarchy, unless it's a very small company, in which case sort of all bets are off. And then I generally think, well, my personal preference is that the product designer focuses on like, okay, how do we actually execute this thing? How do we work with developers so that the thing gets built sort of in the way we imagine? Do we understand the sort of technical limitations from the developers that mean that we cannot build it the way we imagine? And so, yeah, I think I generally split it that way so that the sort of direction and purpose is coming from the product managers and the execution is coming from the designer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And thanks for that. And yeah, and that was a really interesting chat. And I'll just wrap things up. And thanks very much, Anthony, for talking with us.
Thank
really
you all.
Everybody check out Anthony's website and all the resources he's put together. Definitely would recommend them. And hopefully I'll see some of you next month as well.
Yeah, I will say that I like to answer questions. Hopefully you can tell that from this. And so if you have any questions, it should be easy to find a way to get in touch with me from the links above in the chat. So feel free to send me as many questions as you like after this. Forever.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.